Hello out there. I welcome you once again to our Indigenous Hands, Indigenous Voice discussion. And today we are continuing our discussion on the topic, the linguistic blank slate of a deaf child in an indigenous deaf community. You can remember that we are looking at how much the blank slate of a deaf child could be filled. And we touched last week, we touched some of the factors that could play a huge role in getting this linguistic blank slate to be filled up. One of which is the role of caregivers, the parents and other people that are in the life of a deaf child. But today, we want to look at what if these factors are not there, just like we said. These conditions, the three conditions and the two windows, if they are working normally, the brain is going to assimilate as much linguistic elements as are possible, and the linguistic blank slate of any child could be filled up in the process of acquisition through birth, from birth through the first 5 years of that child. For a deaf child whose one of the windows is not working, and the role of the caregivers is not active because the caregiver and the deaf child do not share the same linguistic capacity, or because the deaf child is going to be using sign language and the hearing caregiver is a hearing person. So you find out that there is not going to be the filling of that slate. Now, the question we want to ask today is, what happens when this slate is not filled and the deaf child is growing up? So after 5 years and the deaf child is growing up, that deaf child is going to be growing up as a person without language in his or her life, which you might call languageless. So a deaf child growing up as a languageless person has a whole lot of hindrances, a whole lot of incapacitations, and has some level of inhibition. So the deaf child is not going to be able to perform mentally like any hearing child of his or her age group. But it depends on the deaf child now to take this challenge to himself or herself, and that is when we are going to see the deaf child going out on his own, on her own, to be able to begin to generate language through signing. And that is when we talk about home signs. This was so manifested in the birth of the new language of Nicaragua story or account. Linguists were so baffled when this happened in the 80s, when deaf children from different homes were able to generate and develop their own language with full syntax and grammatical properties. And so this is no longer a new story, but that brought us to a new perspective, a new understanding of how important the innate ability of a child is in developing a language. So that innate ability is not only about the hearing child, it is also about the deaf child. So today I'm going to show you a video of one of our deaf consultants and what he did when he found himself growing up without language. So let us see the story of one of our deaf consultants. Okay, this deaf consultant narrates how when he was growing up, eventually he was not born deaf, but he became deaf at 7 years old. That means he may have developed linguistic ability, when he was hearing. He must have passed through the first 5 years of acquisition. Then he became, immediately after that, he became totally deaf. What did he do? Now that he knows he can no longer use language through his vocal cords and vocal articulators, he said that often he was going out to the community to see other deaf people, other people who look like him. That means people who do not hear. And he was going there to watch them, how they sign. And he started learning how to sign. He said he was going to be sitting there like this very often to see how they sign. And that is how he started learning how to sign. Now, this is not just his own story alone. Almost every deaf consultant that we documented a couple of years ago has the same story in Mogajingari deaf community. And most of them were born hearing and they became deaf from after birth, 1 year, 2 years, depending on when it happened. So their story, in addition to the story of the Nicaraguan children, teach us that even though these factors might not be available for the deaf child at the acquisition age, even though the conditions might not be available for this child, the windows are not very functional like we discussed last week, the deaf child still can go ahead and help himself or help herself up. But this is not an easy job. I resonate with a coder that says that the way for a deaf child to acquire language is filled with obstacles. Filled with such obstacles that you cannot imagine if you are not that deaf child. And that is what we are talking about, the need for a deaf child to have an indigenous language around him or her when he is growing up between birth and the age of 5. We are saying that the language of immediate environment is so important in the life of this child to help the child to develop every other intellectual and emotional, socio-emotional abilities. Now, when these are not there, the deaf child may have to take the challenge upon himself. The family will still be very, very instrumental, because I can remember of one of the parents, a grandparent after all, who was living with his deaf grandson, and he told us a story that his grandson used to pull him on the button of his cloth, pull him on his cloth to point to him whatever he needed. They were together in the house by themselves, but there was no communication because the grandparent was hearing, the grandson was deaf, and there was no other language, means of communication between two of them other than trying to use gestures. Now, the old man that told us the story did not know the kind of role he was supposed to play in helping the child develop home signs. And the worst part of this is that when the deaf child is born in isolation means that the deaf child is born without any other deaf person around him or her, it becomes much more difficult. Our deaf consultant that we just watched was able to learn sign language in the community, in the deaf community, because he saw other deaf people. And there comes the issue of deaf mentoring. It may be a conscious or an unconscious thing, but you find out that that deaf person who is involved, who is at the center of this whole thing, has to do something, has to take a challenge, has to see himself as, I got to deliver myself through this process. The process of not going through a languageless life. If a deaf child misses this opportunity of acquiring language from the immediate environment, it has to be a thing of taking up a challenge, rising up to the occasion, saying, I have to do this because I don't want to go languageless. But whereby a situation where you do not have any language at all in the environment of the deaf child, you do not have people who could model language, other deaf persons who could model language, from whom this deaf person, this deaf child can still learn, it becomes a very huge issue. It becomes a very huge problem for the deaf child growing up. No education, no language. A deaf child is as deaf, and is as deaf as dumb too. Now, our work, like I said last week, is to continue to advocate for the deaf communities to focus on helping a deaf child born in a deaf community to have access to language, to advocate, to help the parents to understand their roles in helping their deaf child who is born in the midst of other hearing siblings to acquire language. When these people do not play their role and the deaf child does not see that as a challenge to pick up after 5 years, it becomes a dark world for the deaf child, who will later become an adult, a languageless adult. So asking about how much the linguistic blank slate of a deaf child could be filled, we have come to understand that during the acquisition period, when that linguistic blank slate is not filled up, the deaf child has to take some challenges upon himself. But we recognize the fact that this is not easy. We recognize the fact that this is not going to go that simply for that deaf child. Today we have seen some of deaf people that have such a story, how they were able to jump into some situations and taking up such challenges of getting themselves indoctrinated into a linguistic community. But we have also seen deaf children growing up where there's no deaf community within this age. And they grow up, the parents, because they are hearing, they are not informed, are unable to send them to school early. And when they get to school, like I pointed out in my last video, they see themselves not only learning subjects that get them educated, but also, first of all, learning a language. And then what makes it more complicated is that if you come to some of the African countries that are using foreign sign language in deaf schools, it becomes another issue that the deaf child is being introduced to a foreign sign language. And this is not good for the child, because language belongs to the indigenous people. Language does not belong to the school. Not every language is a subject of study or course of study in the school. So language does not originate from the school. Language originates from the community, and it is being taught in school. So that deaf child who sees himself or herself learning sign language for the first time in school finds himself learning a foreign sign language. And this, we say, it is totally, totally wrong. So the presence of foreign sign language in indigenous deaf communities is more of a harm than an advantage to deaf children. But if you look at it from another perspective, it becomes something like the only option for some deaf people. It becomes the only option. But the huge disadvantage is when it is causing a huge disadvantage upon the indigenous languages, whereby they are not able to be developed. So today in Indigenous Hands, Indigenous Voices, we are talking about the linguistic blank slate of a deaf child. When it is not filled between the birth of a child to age 5, it becomes a challenge for the deaf child to get himself or herself indoctrinated into a deaf community, whereby the deaf child cannot do it. I bet you his life, her life is going to be somewhat a dark one. Believe me, there are hundreds of deaf people, thousands of deaf people living like this. A languageless life, a dark world for them in our indigenous communities. And this is why we're doing this. And today, I know you may have understood much about the Linguistic Blank Slate. And today I want you to, while you watch this video, do not forget to hit the subscribe button and share the video to as many people as it will benefit. I will see you next week. Bye.